Somewhere around 60, something shifts. Not gradually, the way you always assumed aging would feel, but almost overnight. 1 year, you're keeping pace with everyone around you, and the next, stairs feel steeper, mornings feel heavier, and a full night's sleep doesn't leave you feeling rested anymore. Most people chalk it up to the number on the calendar. They assume this is simply what getting older is supposed to feel like, so they quietly accept it and stop asking questions. I'm Dr. Michael Bennett. After 2 decades in practice, I've had this exact conversation more times than I can count. Someone sits across from me, healthy on paper, no major diagnosis, no red flags on their labs, and they tell me the same thing. I don't feel like myself anymore. And I used to nod along and blame it on age too, until the research forced me to look closer. What changed my mind wasn't a single study. It was noticing the pattern across hundreds of patients who all described the same experience, using almost identical language even though they'd never spoken to one another. That kind of consistency doesn't happen by accident. It happens when something specific and measurable is going on beneath the surface, something with an actual mechanism behind it, rather than just the passage of time. Here's what that research keeps showing. The sudden drop so many people feel after 60 isn't really about age at all. It's about 5 specific shifts happening inside the body at almost exactly the same time. Shifts most doctors never fully explain and most people never see coming. Today, I'm walking you through all 5 in order, from the one that quietly sets the stage to the one I believe is actually running the whole show. Stay with me for number 1, because it's the reason the other 4 hit as hard as they do, and almost nobody connects the dots until I explain it to them. What surprised me most putting this together is how interconnected all 5 turned out to be. They're not 5 separate problems that happen to show up around the same age by coincidence. They feed into each other, which is exactly why the shift so often feels sudden and total rather than gradual and partial. Once you understand the connections between them, the whole picture starts to make a lot more sense, and more importantly, so does what you can actually do about it. Before we start, tell me in the comments how old you are and whether this sudden shift already happened to you, or if you're watching to get ahead of it. I read every single comment, and it shapes what I cover in future videos. Let's start with number 5. And don't underestimate this one just because it sounds almost too simple to matter. Number 5 is the quiet collapse of deep sleep. Sleep doesn't just get shorter as you age, it gets shallower, and that difference matters far more than most people realize. In your 20s and 30s, your body spends a meaningful chunk of the night in deep, slow wave sleep, the stage where tissue repairs itself, where the immune system resets, and where growth hormone is released to rebuild muscle and maintain your metabolism. By the time most people reach their 60s, that deep sleep stage has shrunk dramatically, in some cases to a small fraction of what it once was. You can spend 8 hours in bed and barely touch the restorative stage that actually makes you feel human again. What makes this so easy to miss is that people don't necessarily feel like they're sleeping badly. They fall asleep, they stay in bed the right number of hours, so they assume the sleep itself is fine, and they look everywhere else for the reason they feel drained. In my own practice, I've had patients hand me detailed logs showing 7 or 8 hours a night, absolutely convinced their fatigue had to be coming from something else, when the real story was hiding in the sleep stages nobody was measuring. This is also the stage of sleep most responsible for clearing waste products out of the brain overnight, including proteins linked to cognitive decline. Lose that stage, and you're not just tired the next day. You're accumulating a kind of overnight debt that never gets paid off. And unlike debt in other parts of life, this one compounds quietly. A single rough night barely registers. A decade of shallow sleep is a different story entirely, and it tends to arrive right around the same years everything else on this list starts shifting to, which is exactly why it deserves the first spot on this countdown rather than an afterthought at the end. There's also a piece of this almost nobody mentions at a regular checkup. Deep sleep is closely tied to how well your body regulates blood sugar overnight. Lose enough of it, and you can start seeing subtle shifts in morning glucose levels even without any change to your diet, simply because the stage of sleep responsible for keeping that system calibrated isn't showing up the way it used to. People chase every possible explanation for that number creeping up before anyone thinks to ask how they actually slept the night before. Here's what to do. Keep your bedroom cold, dark, and free of screens for at least an hour before bed, since light exposure late at night is one of the biggest disruptors of deep sleep at this age. Get sunlight within the first 30 minutes of waking, because that single habit does more to anchor your deep sleep cycles than almost anything else available without a prescription. Watch your evening alcohol intake as well, since even a single drink close to bedtime can quietly gut the deep sleep stage without you ever noticing a difference in how quickly you fall asleep. And if you wake up feeling like you never slept at all despite a full night in bed, that's worth mentioning to your doctor, since it can be a sign of something correctable like sleep apnea rather than something you simply have to live with. That's number 5. Number 4 is something almost nobody thinks to check until the damage is already noticeable. Number 4 is the slow erosion of muscle mass, a process with an actual medical name, sarcopenia. Starting around age 30, the average person loses a small percentage of muscle mass every decade without doing anything wrong at all. It's simply the natural drift of the body. But here's the part that catches people off guard. That drift doesn't stay slow. Somewhere around 60, the rate of loss speeds up, in some studies roughly doubling compared to the decades before it. So the muscle loss that used to creep along quietly suddenly accelerates, and that's precisely the age when people start noticing stairs feel harder, jars feel tighter, and getting up from a low chair takes an extra push it never used to need. Muscle isn't just about strength either. It's one of the body's largest storage sites for blood sugar, and it plays a direct role in metabolism, balance, and even immune function. Lose enough of it, and everything downstream starts to wobble. People describe it as feeling suddenly frail, as if their body changed teams overnight, when in reality, this had been building for 30 years and simply crossed a threshold where it became impossible to ignore. What makes this particularly frustrating is how invisible it is on a standard bathroom scale. Someone can weigh exactly what they weighed a decade ago and assume nothing has changed, never realizing that the composition underneath has shifted dramatically, with a meaningful share of that stable weight now being fat where muscle used to sit. The scale stays the same, the strength does not. That mismatch is exactly why so many people are blindsided the first time they genuinely struggle to lift something they used to carry without a second thought. In my own patients, the ones who catch this early are almost always the ones who happen to still be doing some form of resistance training, even lightly, without necessarily knowing why it mattered so much. I've also noticed a pattern worth mentioning. The people who recover fastest after an illness, a fall, or even a simple hospital stay tend to be the ones who walked in with more muscle reserve to draw on. Muscle isn't just about how you look or how easily you climb a flight of stairs. It's a reserve tank the rest of your body quietly depends on during exactly the moments you can least afford to be running on empty. Here's the move. Protein intake becomes non-negotiable after 60, and most people are eating far less of it than their body now requires to maintain muscle, in part because appetite naturally declines with age at the exact moment protein needs are climbing. Resistance training, even just 2 sessions a week with light weights or resistance bands, can meaningfully slow this loss, and in some cases, partially reverse it. You don't need a gym membership or anything extreme. You need consistency, and you need to start treating muscle as something you actively maintain rather than something you simply have. That's number 4. Number 3 is one that rarely gets discussed openly, and I think that silence is exactly why so many people feel blindsided by it. Number 3 is the hormonal cliff. This applies to both men and women, though it shows up differently in each. For women, the hormonal shift around menopause is well documented, but what surprises people is how much of the aftermath continues well past the transition itself, with estrogen's protective effects on bone density, blood vessels, and even mood regulation continuing to fade for years afterward. For men, the shift is quieter, but just as real. Testosterone declines gradually, starting in the 30s, but by 60, many men have crossed into a range low enough to affect energy, motivation, muscle maintenance, and mental sharpness, and almost none of them have ever had it checked. What makes this particular shift so disorienting is that it doesn't just affect the body. It affects mood, drive, and mental clarity all at once, which is exactly why people describe it as suddenly feeling like a different person rather than simply feeling physically older. A patient once described it to me as watching the color drain out of everything. Not dramatically, just a little less vividness in things that used to feel engaging. That's not a mood disorder in most cases. That's chemistry. And it's chemistry that responds to intervention far more than most people realize once it's actually identified instead of quietly endured. There's a reason this particular shift gets so little attention compared to something like menopause. And it comes down to routine. Women are far more likely to have regular checkups built around exactly this stage of life, with doctors trained to ask about it directly. Men rarely get that same prompt. A standard annual physical often never touches hormone levels at all unless the patient specifically asks, which means most men spend years attributing a very treatable shift to simply getting older, working too hard, or being under stress, when a single blood panel could have told a very different story. And because the symptoms overlap so heavily with ordinary fatigue and mood changes, it's easy for both patients and doctors to talk right past the real explanation without ever landing on it. Here's what to do. If you're over 60 and you've noticed a real drop in energy, drive, or mental sharpness, ask your doctor for a full hormone panel rather than assuming it has to be accepted as inevitable. For men, that means actually testing testosterone rather than guessing. And ideally, testing in the morning when levels are naturally at their highest, since a single poorly timed test can produce a misleadingly low number. For women, it means having an honest conversation about what symptoms are still connected to hormonal shifts even years after menopause has technically ended, rather than assuming the transition itself marks the end of the story. This isn't about chasing youth. It's about understanding what's actually changed so you can respond to the real cause instead of quietly adapting to feeling worse. That's number 3. Number 2 is the one I think gets the least credit for how much it's actually running underneath everything else on this list. Number 2 is declining mitochondrial function. Your mitochondria are the small structures inside almost every cell in your body responsible for converting food into usable energy. Think of them as the body's power plants. As you age, 2 things happen at once. You have fewer of them, and the ones you still have become less efficient at their job. By the time most people reach their 60s, the total energy output available to power daily life has measurably declined. Not because anything is broken exactly, but because the machinery producing that energy simply isn't running at full capacity anymore. This is a big part of why fatigue after 60 feels different from fatigue at 30. At 30, you're tired because you did too much. At 60, you can feel tired doing far less than you used to, because the underlying energy supply itself has shrunk. People describe it as a kind of internal battery that used to fully charge overnight and now only gets partway there no matter what they do. And because this happens gradually across every system in the body at once, it rarely gets identified as its own distinct issue. It just gets absorbed into the general feeling of being older, when in reality it's a specific, measurable, and to some degree modifiable process. The organs that feel this shift first tend to be the ones with the highest energy demands to begin with, particularly the heart, the brain, and skeletal muscle, which is part of why declining mitochondrial function so often shows up as brain fog and physical fatigue at the exact same time rather than one before the other. It's rarely an isolated complaint. People mention both in the same breath, describing a kind of full body slowdown rather than a single symptom they can point to. And that combination is precisely what should raise suspicion that something systemic is happening rather than something localized to one part of the body. In my own experience with patients, the ones who make real gains here are almost never the ones looking for a single supplement to fix it. They're the ones willing to combine several smaller habits that each support mitochondrial health in a modest way, stacked together over months rather than expecting a single change to reverse years of gradual decline overnight. Here's the move. Regular movement, even walking, is one of the most reliable ways to stimulate the body to build new, healthier mitochondria, a process researchers call mitochondrial biogenesis. Time-restricted eating, simply narrowing the window during which you eat each day, has also shown promise in supporting this same process, likely because it gives cells periods of genuine rest from constant fuel processing. And ensuring adequate intake of nutrients like CoQ10, magnesium, and B vitamins, all of which play direct roles in the energy production pathway, can make a meaningful difference for people who are genuinely deficient. This isn't about chasing a miracle fix. It's about giving the body's power plants the raw materials and the stimulus they need to keep functioning as well as they still can. That's number 2. Quick pause. If this is helping you understand what's actually happening inside your own body, take 1 second and tap that like button. It genuinely helps this information reach more people who are quietly going through the exact same thing without knowing why. And while you're down there, tell me which of these 5 you think is affecting you the most right now. I read every comment. All right, let's get into number 1. Number 1 isn't really a single system at all, and it may be the reason all 4 of the previous shifts hit as hard as they do when they arrive together in the same decade. Number 1 is chronic low-grade inflammation, a process researchers have started calling inflammaging because it behaves so differently from the inflammation most people are familiar with. This isn't the inflammation you feel from a sprained ankle or a bad flu, sharp, obvious, and temporary. This is a quiet, simmering process that runs in the background for years, often with no clear symptom pointing to it directly. As the immune system ages, it becomes less precise. It starts producing a steady, low level of inflammatory signals even when there's no infection or injury to justify it. And that background noise interferes with nearly every system already discussed today. It disrupts deep sleep. It accelerates muscle loss by directly interfering with the signals muscle needs to repair and rebuild itself, a process researchers have specifically linked to the same inflammatory markers driving this whole picture. It disrupts hormone signaling throughout the body, in some cases directly suppressing the very glands responsible for producing testosterone and estrogen, and it damages mitochondria directly, reducing their efficiency even further and creating a kind of feedback loop where struggling mitochondria produce their own inflammatory byproducts, which then damages more mitochondria in turn. This is why these 5 shifts so often arrive together rather than one at a time. They aren't 5 unrelated problems. They're 5 downstream effects of a single upstream process that's been quietly building for years, largely invisible until it crosses a threshold, and several systems seem to fail at once. That's exactly why 60 so often feels like the year everything changed overnight, when in reality, it was never overnight at all. It was a slow accumulation, finally reaching a tipping point, the same way a slow leak in a tire eventually produces a sudden flat, even though the leak had been there the entire time. What troubles me most about this one is how rarely it gets measured at all in a standard checkup. Most routine blood work never touches inflammatory markers unless a doctor specifically orders them, which means this entire process can run for years, quietly shaping how someone feels day to day without a single test ever flagging it. People are told their blood work looks normal, and in the narrow sense, that's often true, while the actual driver of their fatigue and decline goes completely unmeasured. Here's the hopeful part, and it's the reason I wanted to make this video. Inflammaging is not a fixed sentence. It responds meaningfully to lifestyle changes, often more than people expect once they actually understand what they're targeting. Diet plays an enormous role here. Highly processed foods, excess sugar, and diets low in fiber all feed this background inflammatory process, while diets rich in vegetables, fatty fish, and fiber tend to calm it. Movement matters here too, not just for muscle mitochondria, but because regular activity has a direct calming effect on inflammatory markers throughout the body, even at moderate intensities most people find sustainable. Stress management genuinely belongs on this list as well, since chronic stress hormones feed this same inflammatory pathway in ways most people never connect back to how they physically feel day to day. Sleep, the very first factor we covered, plays a role here too, since poor deep sleep and elevated inflammation feed each other in both directions, which is part of why fixing one so often improves the other. And for some people, a simple blood test measuring inflammatory markers can reveal exactly how much of this is happening beneath the surface, turning a vague feeling of decline into something concrete and something you can actually track and improve over time. This may be the most underestimated factor behind why 60 feels like such a sudden turning point for so many people. And that's exactly why it earns the top spot on this list. Now, I want to hear from you. Of these 5 shifts, which ones do you recognize in your own life right now? Has your energy or your sleep changed in a way that caught you off guard? Tell me in the comments below, and tell me one thing you're going to try this week based on what you just heard. Your answer might be exactly what helps the next person reading it understand they're not imagining any of this. I want to leave you with one last thought before we close out. None of these 5 shifts are things you simply have to accept as the price of getting older. They're processes, and processes can be influenced once you actually understand what's driving them. The people I see age the most gracefully aren't the ones who avoided every single one of these shifts entirely. Almost nobody does. They're the ones who caught it early, understood what was actually happening inside their own body, and made small, consistent adjustments instead of waiting for a crisis to force the issue. That's really the entire purpose of this video. Not to alarm you, but to hand you the map most people never get, so that instead of quietly wondering what happened to you somewhere after 60, you can actually do something about it starting today. And before you go, there's something else worth knowing. The way you feel after 60 isn't only shaped by what's happening inside your body. It's also shaped by a handful of everyday habits most people never think twice about. Habits that quietly speed up every single shift covered today. Most people have no idea they're doing them. That's the topic of the next video. I'll walk you through the 5 habits accelerating aging that almost nobody suspects. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you there.